Hi, and welcome back to Glassbox writing automated Java tests using WebDriver. Today we're going to look at how to read data from an external file, such as an Excel file, and then use that data to run an automated test. We will look at what this concept is called when we try and take data from an external file and use it to dictate how a test runs, how we can do this, and why we would want to do this. So the first question is, what is this concept called? Why would someone want to read data from an external file and use that in our test? Now, this isn't the same as saying reading data from, say, a Java properties file. No, this is much more external. This is more external to the extent that we read data from, say, a file such as an Excel file. The reason you want to do this is to have your test driven by data in an Excel file, or in other words, key data from an Excel file. And this concept is actually an existing framework concept, and is called a keyword-driven framework. A keyword-driven framework is where you have data in an external file. In this case, we'll be using an Excel file, and the data is read from that Excel file and then used to run a test. When the test runs, typically what you do is write data back to that Excel file. So let's do that. So in this video tutorial, that's what we'll be doing. We'll be trying to see how we can create a fresh keyword-driven framework from scratch using Maven, and we'll see how we can use that framework to read data from an external file and what tools we have available to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just quickly navigate to the Java test site, and the scenario we're going to automate is pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to click on each of these links. So for instance, home, adoption, about, and contact, and on each link we're going to check to see this text here on the page title tab. That's it, nothing too complicated. So before we even look at a framework, what we need to do is actually translate this information into an Excel data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have an Excel file, and I'm going to start creating this data. So the first column, I'm going to call it links. The second column I'm going to call headings, and that's it. So the first link I have was home, my second link was adoption, the third is about, and the final one is contact. And if we go to the home link, so this has a value of zoo adoption line home, so let's call it that. The second one is called adoption. The about link has a title with about zoo, and contact has a tab title called contact. Okay, so we now have our data ready. So what we want to do is somehow be able to read this data and say that when we click on the home link, we expect this to be the title. When we click on the adoption link, we expect this to be title, and so on. So now what we need to do is translate this information into an automated test. And typically what you would have is, as a result of doing this, you'd also have some kind of results tab, results column, where you will store this result here. So let's just say for the moment, let's just leave this as pending for the moment. And what we're expecting is when we say hit this link and we look at this heading and check against it, if it's that heading, we're going to change this to a result of pass. If it isn't that, we're going to change it to a result of fail. And that's the concept of a keyword driven framework. The concept is quite simple. We pass in this Excel file into some test, and the test runs, and then the test results are printed here, and we need our Java framework to handle all of that for us. So before we actually save this Excel, let's go ahead and create our framework first, so then we'll have a location to save to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say file, new, project, and I'm gonna search for Maven project and use that. The reason why we're using Maven is because it's going to help us manage our dependencies a little bit more easier. So in the past, for a couple of my frameworks, I directly got the jars from searching on the web. I want to step away from that for this particular tutorial video and use Maven because it makes life just a little bit easier. So anyway, click next. Click next here, we don't really mind about this. And on the group ID, this will effectively be the name of the package that your tests and various other main apps fall in. So call this whatever you like. I've given it my domain name. The artifact ID is effectively the name of your project. So I'm going to call it Maven WebDriver keyword framework. This is just to help me identify what the framework is without having to look inside it. But you can call this whatever you like. And then finish. So now you should have a new project generated. So expand that. And what we should do is click on the POM file. So once your POM file is open, just navigate to pom.xml. And in here, what we're going to do is add in a couple more dependencies and upgrade an existing one. So the first thing we're going to do is upgrade JUnit from 4.8.1. This might be different on your machine. I'm just going to upgrade it to 4.11. I also need to add in two more dependencies. The first for Selenium, so that we can write a WebDriver test, and the second for a POI library. It's a library that we will use to read from our Excel file. So let's go ahead and do that first. So to save a little bit of time, I'm just going to copy the JUnit library twice, and I'm just going to overwrite these files with the Selenium ones. So the Selenium dependencies are org selenium hq dot selenium, and the artifact is selenium-java, and the version we want is 2.4.2.2, and we don't need scope. We also need to import in a POI library. So let me explain what this additional library is. Java traditionally doesn't provide any libraries for us to easily be able to read data from external files such as an Excel file, a Word file, any file that uses XML standardization. So we are using a library that has been written by Apache called the POI library, which basically provides us with a number of methods, or rather API calls, which allow us to read data from such files. So to use that dependency, we will need to type in org apache.poi. The artifact is POI, and the version we want is 3.9. Again, we don't need scope. So now if you click on Maven dependencies, you should only see a JUnit, which was the old version. If you now save your project should now go off and download many more jars, i.e. all the jars that we've asked for in our dependencies. So save that. Looks like I have an error when I tried to grab the dependency. That's because I misspelled it. It's POI. So let's save that again. So like I said, once you save your project, and assuming you've done all of this correctly, it will go off and it will grab all the jars that we've asked for. So assuming we didn't do this and we manually tried to search for all of these jars, you can kind of tell how this would be a little bit painful on our end. But by doing it this way, we now have all the dependencies already for us to use. Fantastic. So a couple more things before we get dug in. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this app.java. I don't need it. And I'm also going to open up the source test directory and delete this app test. Again, something I don't need. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually start creating a utility class that we'll use to be able to read data from our Excel file. But before I do that, what I want to do is really quickly go back to the Excel file and just save that inside the root directory of our project. So if I just try and do that first, and now I'm just going to navigate to my project. So this is the root directory of my project, and I'm just going to call this script, this Excel file, page heading, and I'm going to save it as an Excel 97 and 2003 workbook. Save. If you go to your project and just right click like I did and do a refresh, you should also see your Excel file appear in the directory of your project, and that's where we'll keep it for the moment. So like I said, the first thing we're going to do is create a utility class. Let's do that. I'm going to right click on the package, go new, and create a class, and I'm going to call this Excel file handler. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a public method that will return a 2D array, so in this case a list of strings, and I'm going to call this method read from file, and I'm going to pass in an argument into this method, i.e. the file that we want to read from, and that's it. So what I want to do is, well, for starters, I want to actually return a list, as that's what I've stated. So I'm just going to create again another list string, and I'm going to call this table, and this is going to be equal to a new array list of list, and in it we're going to have strings, and I'm going to go ahead and import in the libraries. Okay, and I'm also going to just say return table. This is just to satisfy that the method is fine for the moment. So now what do we need to do? Well, the reason I have a 2D array is to accommodate our Excel file, in that when we pass in this information, we're going to pass in an array of links, and inside the links there's going to be an array of headings. So that's why I've used a 2D array. You don't have to stick with 2D arrays, you can do it any other way you want, but I think 2D arrays are just a little bit more easier to work with for the moment anyway. So now that we've assumed this is how we're going to handle our information, now we need to actually start processing this information. So the first thing we need to do is, when we pass in our file, we need to somehow process that, or rather convert that into something we can use in our code. So to do that, I'm going to use a file input stream, and I'm going to call this file, and I'm going to have this equal to a new file input stream, and I'm going to call this a new file, and this is where I'm going to pass in my file name. So again, go ahead and input in the libraries. And you'll also encounter another error where you will have to surround this whole thing and try and catch. So you can do this manually, or you can just do it via the easy provided message boxes. Okay, and I'm just going to get rid of that because I don't need that. Right. So what this will do is, this will now allow us to process the file by turning it into a file input string. Now we need to actually be able to somehow process the Excel file. And to do that, we're going to use some of the methods provided in the POI libraries we've grabbed through our Maven dependencies. So the first method we need to use is called the workbook method, and this is how we use it. So what does this do? This method basically allows us to convert our file into a workbook. A workbook is basically a type of Excel file which basically contains many strings, many sheets. So if we have a quick look at our Excel file, this is treated as a workbook. A workbook is basically an Excel file. An Excel file can have many sheets. So in this case we've got 3 sheets, and then on each sheet we have rows and columns. So that's what a workbook is. A workbook is pretty much what an Excel file is. So let's go ahead and import that in. Again, this throws an exception, so we just need to catch it. Okay, just leave that like that for the moment. Now what we need to do is grab the first sheet from that workbook. So again, very similarly, we just do HSSF equal to workbook dot get sheet at, and in this case on the first sheet. So now what we're doing is quickly import this in first. We are now getting the first sheet, i.e. this first sheet, and we are using it based off our workbook. So this now gives us access to this first effectively tab on our Excel workbook. So once we've got that, now what we need to do is somehow be able to look through each row in this Excel workbook. And to do this, we can actually use an iterator. And we will iterate through the rows. What the iterator allows us to do is to look through a collection of objects one at a time. It's very similar to the concept of a for loop or a while loop, where we are able to look through things one after another and then act on them as we look through them. So let's go ahead and import in the libraries first. So now that we've got effectively a number of rows that's stored somewhere, we can start to actually look through them. So to do this, we're going to use a while loop, and we're going to say row iterator dot has next. This is basically a boolean check to check that there is another element still left to look through. And the first thing we're going to do is create a list string, and we'll call this row data to store our data somewhere. And this can be a new array list of strings, and we'll come back to why we're doing this in a moment. But for the moment, we will need to use this to store the data. The next thing we're going to do is create a row, and we're going to base this off the row iterator. So this basically tells us what row we're currently on effectively. And now that we know what row we're on, we can start to think about what cell we're on also. So again, we're going to use an iterator to look through cells, and we're going to call this cell iterator. and this is going to be to our row dot cell iterator. Again, let's import in the library. So what do we have so far? Well, at the moment we have a list of strings which is going to contain some row data which will be relevant in a bit. We are looking through each row by using the row iterator, and then for each given row we're looking through the cell by using the cell iterator. So we've got now some means of looking through each row, and in each row looking through each cell. So what we now need to do is actually process this information on each cell level. So to do this, again, we're going to use another while loop, and this time we're going to look through the cell iterator, and we're going to check to see it's got an item. And in the cell iterator we're going to create a new cell so that we are able to act on an individual cell, and we're going to call it the cell iterator dot next. And here what we're going to do is, as we grab information from our Excel file, we need to check that the information we're getting, what type of information it is. So in this case it's a string, but for all intents and purposes this could be, say, a Boolean value, this could be a numeric value. So we need to kind of cater for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to check to see the type of information this cell contains by doing a quick switch case on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in switch. Inside the switch we're just going to do get cell type for any given cell. And we're going to say in case cell dot cell type, in this case let's just say it's Boolean, then we will say add to our row data a string value of cell dot get Boolean cell value. So what this will now do is, if the value inside a particular cell is a Boolean value, we will convert that value into a string, and then we will add it to our row data, i.e. to this row here. We'll do the same thing for numeric and strings, so all we have to do is just copy that. And the final one is, like I said, of type string. Now the string one obviously we don't need to convert because it returns a string. Now let's quickly make this a little bit more presentable. So by holding Ctrl Shift L, it brings up a list of quick actions we can perform, and if we type format and then click on that, it should format our code a bit. So let's go ahead and do that manually then. So what we're doing here is we're saying for any given type of cell, based on the information, convert that to a value that we can store in our row data. Since our row data has a list of strings only, it's not generic, we can only use strings. We convert the data to the relevant type, and then we can use it in our test by converting it to a string. So the final thing we need to do as part of this iterator is to actually add this row data to our table. So if we say table.add, and then we just say row data and add it to our table. So by typing in table.add row data, what will effectively happen is each row data that we capture here will now be added to this row data, and then the row data will be added to the table, effectively building up data for each given row as a set of information we can then use in our table. So this method should now cater for our needs. So let's go through this from top to bottom really quickly first. We created a 2D array list of table. So this table, like I said, will contain two folds of information. The first would effectively be pointing to a column, and the second will be pointing to a row for that given column that we're on. We had to convert the file we pass into something we can use, and then we had to convert the file into an Excel workbook from which we were able to derive a sheet. On the sheet, we were then able to get a row iterator and look through each row. From that row, we were able to look through each cells and then capture the information in each cell and put it inside a row data list of strings. From that, we were able to add it back into our 2D array, which ultimately we will return as a result of this method. So this method should now return us the information we pass into our Excel document. So it looks like we've spent a great deal of time trying to write a method to help us convert the file, and I think this is a lot of information, so let's leave it here for today. In our next video, we'll actually look at writing a test for this and seeing how we can use the method. Until next time, ciao. Hi guys, I really appreciate you watching my videos, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you already haven't, hit the subscribe button below to stay up to date with my latest videos, which I release every Wednesdays and Sundays. Also, follow me on Twitter, Facebook and Google. Links in the description below. Until next time, ciao.